I am Taylor O'Neill Hall, and this is my presentation on a pedagogy of collaboration in the dual credit / dual enrollment classroom. All right, so the goals for my project were to apply a collaborative pedagogy to teaching dual credit / dual enrollment first year composition courses. So this is writing as community. And I wanted to incorporate low stakes writing as an introduction to higher stakes writing. Low stakes is a way for students to interact with each other through weekly discussion posts and then conduct guided peer review with the goal of student growth in mind. So some of the primary sources that I used for this project were James Berlin, Peter Elbow, Nancy Summers, Ann George, Rebecca Moore Howard, Kimberly M. Baker, and Penny L. Gray. And so all of these sources contributed something to the overall goal of the project. And so when thinking of different rhetorical pedagogies, they all lend something different. There's a unique focus for each one of these things. And so while going for a more collaborative approach in the classroom, social epistemic is the closest aligned with what I wanted for creating that kind of environment in the classroom, since social interaction is key. Whereas expressivist, it's more of like an internal pursuit of knowledge, and then cognitive pedagogy, there's an emphasis on like grammatical correctness and various things like that. So as James Berlin found, for social epistemic rhetoric, the real is located in the relationship that involves the dialectical interaction of the observer, the discourse community, or social group, in which the observer is functioning, and the material conditions of existence. All right, so as George found, traditional critical pedagogies engage students in analysis of the unusual power relations that produce and are produced by cultural practices and institutions. So that includes schools, and they hope to enable students to challenge the inequality. So there is essentially the rhetorical approach that I decided to go with for the project was one that kind of encompassed ideas from social epistemic initially to then critical pedagogy in some ways, and then incorporating collaborative learning as well. And so essentially just getting students to think critically about their own situations, their own writing, how to incorporate that into like a discussion-based environment, discussion-based classroom. So as Howard found, collaborative learning can be used in a multitude of ways in the composition classroom, one of the most obvious being peer review. And so that's another focus for the whole entire project, is like creating this learning environment where students can collaborate with one another in hopes of creating the best possible writing that they can. And this is done by starting with low stakes writing, easy assignments, just free writes, etc., and then transitioning more so to higher stakes assignments with the incorporation of peer review as well. And so all of these things kind of lend themselves to having a collaborative learning environment, so that students can help each other grow throughout the writing process. All right, so low stakes versus high stakes, which is just something that was written extensively by Peter Elbow. And so low stakes assignments, they get students thinking about course materials. They're informal, they're very quick, like journals, think pieces, etc. The goal is not to produce excellent prose, and these are formative assessments. They're like building towards that higher stakes assignment, which is summative, of course. So higher stakes, they're judged carefully for soundness and clarity of presentation, more loaded, needed to gauge student learning. And so, as Elbow said, when we assign a piece of writing and don't comment on it, we are not teaching. We are actively setting up powerful conditions for learning by getting students to do something they wouldn't do without the force of our teaching. So like when you have a student do a blog post or a weekly discussion post or something along those lines, they have to interact with the course materials. Maybe it's not graded so harshly like a higher stakes assignment, like a more in-depth essay, but they're still interacting with course materials, still utilizing what is being discussed in the course, and then they can use that whenever they start working on the higher stakes assignment. All right, and so like I said, the goal is to start with low stakes assignments, build towards higher stakes assignments, and then start working in peer review. And so peer review is something that has been written about by several different people, but just for the sources I used for my own projects would be Gray, Baker, and Summers. And they all essentially found that peer review can help students teach each other, which again incorporates the concept of collaborative learning, where students are learning from one another as they're engaging with course materials. All right, so the benefits of a collaborative pedagogy. So Lose et al. Found that collaborative learning can have a positive impact on student persistence in the student's second year of college if they were exposed to a collaborative learning environment during their first year of college. And so that's the whole point, relating this to the dual credit / dual enrollment classroom, is that these are still high school students who are taking on these different philosophies as they transition to college. And so Lose et al. Examined 2,987 college freshmen at 19 institutions and found that learning collaboratively leads to greater levels of positive peer interactions, which in turn is associated with greater odds of persisting to the second year of college. And so my goal for the project would be to incorporate these things: collaborative learning, critical pedagogy, social epistemic approach, and all that different stuff, to the dual credit / dual enrollment classroom, where students are still high schoolers. And so, again, like I said, the whole idea here is to start with the low stakes assignments and then use those to build into peer review eventually, and have the students incorporate collaborative learning as they're working on their higher stakes assignments. So the low stakes assignments is basically just a way for them to interact with one another, interact with various ideas in a very low stakes manner, rather than something that is going to be graded more critically. So when I set up peer review, I want there to be a Dear Reader letter. So this is just like one person writes this letter to another person, essentially asking for questions, asking the questions that they have to the person who's going to be reading their letter or their paper. And so one thing that Baker found in her study was to set up peer review 24 hours before class starts. So if class is on Tuesday that we're going to do peer review, make sure the submission date and everything like that is 24 hours in advance of that. That way everybody has to submit it. And so students are graded on the quality of their feedback, not the contents of the draft. And so it's mainly about helping one another as they're doing peer review. And reviewers listen to the reviewee. And so the whole point is just give the person who is having their paper reviewed the opportunity to ask questions to the person who's reviewing it, like, does my thesis work? What did you think about the evidence that I am using here? Things like that, so that they can get feedback before they submit the paper ultimately. And so I created like a sample Dear Reviewer letter and a reviewer checklist. So the reviewer checklist is something that the person who is doing the peer review, they look for these things, give feedback on all the various things like the thesis, the intro, the evidence that is used, the formatting, all the different stuff. And then the Dear Reviewer letter asks the person to answer all these questions. So like they have to state, what's the thesis of their essay, Which area of the essay do you think is the weakest? Things like that. And that way, whenever the reviewer is looking these things over, they have how the person feels about their essay in mind as they're going through it. And so then just like basically an outline of how each higher stakes unit could work, something like this. So where it kind of is just a cycle that continues to go. So you start with the new content, whatever that may be. Maybe it's comparative critique or something. Do low stakes writing that kind of involves elements of comparative critique, or comparative analysis, or research-based analysis, whatever it may be. So you do the low stakes writing, which is like the weekly practice. Then you have first draft questions, which builds into peer review, and that goes to the higher stakes assignment being due. And then it starts over with the next unit. And so basically they're doing low stakes writing, interacting with each other for discussion posts, etc. And then that eventually builds into the higher stakes assignment being due. So week 1, you could introduce the higher stakes assignment. 2, continue working on the assignment. Weeks 3 to 4, guided peer review and revisions. And then maybe week 5, it's due. And so what Baker found was setting the peer review date several weeks before the final due date was an effective strategy because it required students to start working earlier rather than later. So instead of having a student just submit something at the very last minute, they have to be working on the paper much earlier than when it's actually due. And so timeline of each unit, you introduce the essay assignment, work on it, do the peer review, and then the essay is due. All right, so that is my presentation over a pedagogy of collaborative learning in the dual credit and dual enrollment classroom. Thank you very much.